Welcome to the Pacesetter Pod, where we explore and reveal the perspectives, insights, and approaches to deliver great results and growth in your agribusiness through better execution. Here's your host, the Integration Pacesetter, Joe Mosier.
Welcome, Pacesetters of Agribusiness, to another episode of the Pacesetter Pod. I'm your host, Joe Mosier. A quick reminder before today's episode. If you haven't done so already, now is a great time to subscribe to the podcast and ensure that you never miss any of the content or the conversations that we publish each week to help you deliver better results in your agribusiness through better strategy execution. Now, if you've been listening for any amount of time, you probably picked up on the fact that we like to have good conversations. We like to dig into topics that maybe require a bit more exploration, a bit of intellectual meandering, if you will. And that's really rooted in the fact that I want this show to be about ideas, right? I want to show that a podcast that critically looks at the conditions in which we operate, conditions that are exogenous to your organization, like economic conditions, the weather, supply and demand, trade policy, things of that nature, but also the endogenous conditions like how our own supply chains are constructed and operated and maintained, the things that we have control over within our supply chains, within our organizations. And the reason I say this is that I feel very strongly that a critical look at those internal and external factors of our supply chain and how we independently operate within it, coupled with talking about the lessons learned from others about how to start and grow and scale and adapt a successful agribusiness, put together, those things will have real outsized benefit to the future of our industry. And I feel like it's an exciting topic, it's energizing, and it needs to happen. And so with that in mind, I am thrilled today to share a recent conversation that I had with Andrew Hoelscher of Farm Strategy. So this discussion, just kind of give you a couple of highlights here. We're going to talk about what Andrew has characterized as an efficiency preoccupation within production ag. Our focus on yield, our focus on efficiency, and all of it built on what is now becoming clear is likely a fallacy of 10 billion mouths to feed. He's going to talk about how we only indirectly feed the world and the multiple chains in the supply and value chain between the farmer and the folks that consume the food that we suggest that we produce. And a lot of it then we're going to break down is how this is really born of a choice that we've all made to solve food manufacturing problems with science and additives, and not really looking at production ag as a potential source of those solutions. And then from that, through his business farm strategy, we talk about what a different economic model of the existing supply chain could look like, and how ultimately, if done well, it could accrue more value to the producer, more value to the farm, which is something that we all seem to be in service of, but sometimes is quite elusive in doing. And then finally, of course, what stands in the way of a real seismic shift in the way that we have built and operated and now need to and have chosen to defend the supply chains that exist. So one of the things I want to comment on, though, separate from the content, is we were having some audio issues on my end when we recorded. So it's not going to be on my normal recording equipment. It's going to be on a headset. So you're going to see some audio quality differences, and I apologize for that. None of it should be a barrier to understanding and following the conversation, but I did want to call that out because it's a bit different than a typical episode. And so with that, again, this is a conversation about ideas. I found it energizing. I walked away optimistic and intellectually stimulated thinking about the supply chain, and I hope you do too. And so with that, here's my conversation with Andrew Hoelscher of Farm Strategy. Andrew Hoelscher, it is good to see you this morning. Welcome to the Pacesetter Pod.
Good to see you, Joe. It's good to be here.
So, Andrew, we had a pre-call here, and what I'm excited about is you've got some, let's call them non-consensus views on the agricultural supply chain infrastructure that we've built over time. Perhaps contrarian, perhaps controversial, but we'll get into that. But one of the things that we talked about when we met here earlier this summer was the observation, the very real observation I agree with, is that our industry has really built infrastructure and supply chains and partnerships that are really created around this premise that we need to produce and move rivers of grain that are going to feed demand forecasts that have for decades been uniformly up and to the right. And
Yeah.
so in the process of needing to meet those demands and creating these rivers of grain, so that hyper efficiency at the farm gate, the operating focus of all the systems has been yield and efficiency.
Yes.
I've heard you say that we have an efficiency preoccupation problem. And so, talk to us about the system we have and what you mean by efficiency preoccupation problem.
Yeah, I think understand, and we'll get into this a little later, the family farm delivers grain into these rivers of grain and makes money at it. And so we're participating and living in the tension that's there with it. But yeah, I think it's been good. We've built a system that handled the market that we needed to for what the future holds. And I think you had some guys from CoBank on here. Matt Clark, a good friend with Terrain Ag, is going to say, like, the future world that we've built this system for is beginning to change, right? Whether it be Chinese demand, whether it be the food security of different places, just on a global size. But that efficiency preoccupation, what it's caused us to do is obviously assets, which once again, the family participates in, and we're so grateful that they're there. But it's caused secondary issues inside of the market. And so this preoccupation of up and to the right, what it does is it's caused us to lose sight of this. I'll use an example. I drive down the interstate here in Kansas, and there's a sign, I think it's put up by Farm Bureau. It's like every Kansas farmer feeds like 147 other people or something like that, right? So, it's this idea that we're a small number in agriculture and look at us feeding people. And as we've gotten into the food business, what we've actually begun to realize is, like, you're providing a base ingredient. But to say that you're providing food is actually not the case, right? Like, we're providing a bulk commodity flow that allows basic calories, but to call it food isn't there. And so in that, as we go up and right and been obsessed with up and right and, produce more bushels, agronomy research is focused almost exclusively on the farmer. And so fertility, cost savings, those genetics, it's based around the fact that you sell genetics to a farmer, and a farmer's incentive is to go up and right in terms of producing more, not producing value. Now, we'll say it's ROI, but ROI is simply based on bushels times price, and that price is all referenced into an international domestic trade market, but bushels versus price against cost. And so whatever that is, whether it be grain systems, whether it be agronomy research, the other piece that's there that's kind of one that we wrestle with internally is this even management capabilities, right? We have generations of leaders who've grown up inside of ag that have always known feed 10 billion people, and it's up and to the right, get it, produce it, and get it shipped. Like, that's where we're at. And we've lost sight of the fact that there's tremendous value in this idea of food versus producing a bulk commodity. And that's where, we want to kind of, I'm not saying abandon the system. I'm not saying the system's wrong. I'm not saying the system, blow up the system. But the reality is, I think we've given up our ability to say we're food producers a little bit because we've been preoccupied with being bulk efficiency producers. And I think there's tremendous opportunity there.
Yeah. And so again, this idea of the 10 billion mouths to feed, which is, some folks are sort of just becoming aware of the longitudinal models suggesting that we may reach 10. If we do, that'll be a point of plateau. It's not 10 and continuing to grow. Some folks are now wondering if we actually will reach 10 or if there'll be a population decline or contraction, something close to 9.95, and we don't, we could debate that number, but I don't think that's really the point today. But
I don't know if I'm educated enough to debate that with you. Like, it's just, I know it's out there, right?
Well, the beauty of a podcast is you can put two people on there unqualified to debate something and speak authoritatively about it. But we do have the system and leadership and management folks that have worked in a context where there's really an unconstrained demand signal, and it
Absolutely.
is driving bushels per acre and get it done. And if I'm hearing you correctly, it's almost that the agricultural production, the commodity production, the high volume, high efficiency, high yield production, we're not feeding people, we're feeding a food system. Is that part of the point here?
Yeah. So I think the easiest way to demonstrate that, like if I can build a cost stack with your growers, maybe to like convey that idea. And so if we were to start, a cost stack is essentially to take every expense that it takes, and we're going to use bread because we function in wheat. If you take the whole cost structure of what it takes to get bread delivered to the grocery store. So you're going to have everything stacking up there, right? The farmer's rent or ownership cost of that piece of land, fertility, chemistry, labor, equipment ownership. And all of that's going to build up to what we'll essentially call the farmer's share of that cost stack. Then he hands it over to a grain handler. That grain handler has some different cost to it, has an ROI to it. Obviously, we're not taking into account that a farmer can produce below that cost. We're just building the stack. And so as we begin and we layer these people on, and then you get to the flour mill and they have grain costs, which are made up of everybody else's cost. They have their milling costs, processing costs. And then what you have is you have this secondary piece that gets added on there, which is additives, other enhancers, these type of things that get added into that bakery system or milling system, which those exist because the wheat does not make the proper loaf of bread for people. And so when you put those additives on, what you have is a additive that there's some additive cost stacks out there that we know about, that the additive portion to the wheat is 2 times the value of the wheat. So in other words, if you're putting in a $5 bushel of wheat to make bread, you would have $10 in additives against that in order to make a loaf of bread. And so when we preoccupy ourselves with the bottom portion of that stack and make it about the bulk movement of that grain and call it food, what we know as a company is that there's a whole nother portion of that cost stack that if we could capture that value through genetics, agronomy, intelligence, segregated handling, whatever it is, if we can capture that value and drive it back down into the bottom of the cost stack, we could now actually have a much larger value proposition on wheat as compared to just marginal trade values.
And how does this, that's an interesting observation, this sort of the cost stack and looking at all the things that are required to produce that bushel of wheat. And then that's the imputed value of the wheat in this calculation. We're saying that actually the additives are taking 2 times the value of that. How do we get to a place where the additive manufacturing is solving for where genetics, segregation, intelligence, agronomy, as you said, don't provide a bulk commodity that meets the needs of those millers and those bakers?
I think it's 2-pronged. There's the ability to build the supply chain that actually delivers it, right? I mean, because that's the piece. It's very easy to have additives or enhancers or any of those type of things. Like those are more manufacturing based. They're not necessarily subject to weather and distribution issues that, a bulk commodity would be subject to for sure. The other piece is like those problems are mostly abstract from agriculture. So if we were to actually go into, call it a commercial bakery, and this isn't large scale. I'm not saying that there's not a wonderful community bakery that is sourcing its wheat and knows these type of things. Like I think that's there, but I think we're talking at scale is more of what we're talking. If you were to go to that bakery is going to be at least 2, most likely 3, and sometimes 4 business units removed from production agriculture. And so because what we've in agriculture, and it's what the markets needed, right? We needed to get grain to mouth that were hungry, and it was profitable to do such, and there were business models that were lubricated to do that. I think one of these next ventures that we begin to take inside of agriculture is to actually go and penetrate into the idea of food and food solutions. No different than like the first time somebody tried to, let's go, I don't know the case study, but if we were to go look at like getting soybeans into China, right? There has to be some amount of communication that happened with a person there what does it take to trade in China? What are the usages in China? What actually works here? How can we deliver the product here? What's the volume that's necessary? We have to do that level of work inside of the food industry. So to the food company, like, what's your problem?
Mm-hmm.
How consistently is this a problem? What's your loss that's caused by this problem? What's the economic possibility that's potential in this? And then you have to work it back down. And what ag is really good at focusing on is focusing on, I'll say, ourselves a little bit, right? Like, we have these wonderful communities of my agronomist focuses on me, the seeds genetics guy focuses on me. And so we have a lot of ag input that is focused to the farmer. And so our innovation, even our market signals for purchasing seed is driven by the farmer. And so we're solving that farmer's ROI information. We're not actually selecting genetics for food solutions. We're selecting for farmer solutions. So that's where it's, we have to go to the market and begin to work ourselves backwards to build that understanding of, okay, how do we do this? How do we build trust and show we can actually do it?
I think this is really interesting because, and kind of if I pan back for just a moment, there's a couple of questions or comments I have on what you just said. But within any business, and ag, I think is probably a prime example, we all tend to grow up and learn about and eventually master and then try to shape a value chain that we participate in and how we create value with our businesses. And
Absolutely.
If we think about this value chain, supply chain, this idea of being able to, you use the word, we built a system that could deliver grain. Well, when that system was being built, particularly after the Civil War, and you think about the late 19th century, it probably was largely distributing wheat into urban areas that were going to bakers that were making that something, a very short shelf life product that was being bought at the bodega or the corner market or being delivered, whatever it is. And what has happened is, I think, as the way that we manufacture and distribute food, the expectations around ready-to-eat meals, the need for longer shelf lives on products, et cetera, if we never took the moment to go back and say, okay, how could we redesign the system that delivers to deliver something different and better appropriate to the evolving needs? We might have done this a long time ago, but what we did is we actually said, okay, we've got a system that will guarantee that we can produce enough wheat as an ingredient into your manufacturing process. However, that wheat is going to have deficiencies, like you said, at the point of genetics, agronomy, et cetera. And so that creates the opportunity for the additive manufacturer to create solutions that maybe production ag isn't solving, because we actually never, if I hear you correctly, we never asked production ag to solve it. We let science solve it in the interim. Is that correct?
I mean, I think that's a broad brush, probably.
Sure.
And I think there's nuance. But once again, in doing this at that commercial level, right? So sure, when we originally had that, bodega or the bread store, back in, but that's not where we're at, right? And I do think the better ROI for what this mixture of, production technology with capable execution of grain, with who was the loudest voice demanding a need for supply of grain, that we built the right model, right? Like, if you were to look at ethanol and corn, if you were to look at soy and, the China, like, it would be hard to sit here and say we didn't build the right model to drive ROI systems and to drive growth into agriculture. I think it was a good decision. Just one of the consequences of focusing on that decision is that we got really good at focusing on that decision. Right. And what we left is we let, and call it an ancillary market, call it a secondary market, but we left another side of the market, which was based around this idea of U.S. food, right? And so we've handed over some of the capability of production agriculture to the food chemist or to somebody who presently today is abstract from us because we weren't in that conversation, which, once again, I'm not saying it was bad that we weren't in it. It's just the fact that we weren't. I mean, so if you take a food company today, and if you were to go to them and say, hey, I want to be a food supplier, or I want to be a food solution supplier for you, but I'm going to do it through agronomy and I'm going to do it through genetics. There's a few of them out there that are, willing to go there, but it's not common, right? The genetics groups that we work with, like every once in a while, there's the dog and pony show that shows up with a food customer, right? And they're like, this is who produces our wheat. But we're not having the engagement of, man, these are my manufacturing problems. These are my consumer issues that I'm having. How do we build genetics and test plots and production systems that solve those issues? Like those are handled not based on production ag. And so, like, once again, not to like destroy the system, because I think it pursued the right economic model. It's just as one model matures and potentially has some viability questions in the future, whether it's real or not, it just has some questions. I think we can start to have the conversation about the secondary model that is, well, what if I can solve food? And what is that actually worth per acre as compared to like per pound when you're having to purchase an ingredient?
What's interesting about this conversation for me is we're talking about, and I do paint things with a broad brush, I'll admit that, but in this case, it's in some ways augmenting the supply chain of partners to perhaps narrow the requirements of the opportunity for the additive manufacturers if we can solve more of these food manufacturing problems through better genetics, better quality of agricultural production, et cetera. Now, what's in the headline right now, of course, is you think about MAHA or Make America Healthy Again, and the
Sure.
messaging coming out. A lot of it would be, they don't talk about additives as much as preservatives and ultra processed food, but there is a moral or a health agenda there that would advocate for trying to create more direct connection of real food into human consumption. What you're talking about here, though, too, if I'm reading correctly, is this might result in some of those same outcomes, but it's also, if we are narrowing the opportunity or the reliance upon the additive manufacturer in producing food in this country, and we're doing that through producing different quality, different profile grain off the farm, I assume that more value accrues to the producer in this model. Is that correct?
Yeah. And the production system, right? Because it actually takes more money to IP segregate grain rather than to bulk commodity deliver it. And so you have to provide an economic incentive for all parties to want to participate inside of this system. I mean, that's just the part of it. Within, premise that we want to function on is we actually want to change the cost structure of the food that that's being made and that's being consumed. So, I like the idea of Make America Healthy Again, and some of it's there. I think there's credibility to it. I really do. And I find it kind of, now, our vantage point is that we've been inside of this industry building these supply chains. I wish that ag would embrace that idea, because I actually think production agriculture can provide tremendous food solutions if it's fully engaged. There's a little bit of pushback of like agriculture versus MAHA and what can go on. And I understand there's a lot of ancillary arguments around that. But in terms of providing better food to people, that's an economic incentive that I think is viable for agriculture. But understand, you have to do it in a way that makes economic sense. And I would even say that your economics have to lead. So if I'm going to sell an ingredient from a production agriculture system into a food company, I don't win because of clean labeling. I don't win because of sustainability. I don't win because of regenerative ag. Like, we win at this commercial scale that we're doing, okay? I'm not saying the small scale, but I think for your audience, we're talking bulk flow grain, enough bushels to actually move the needle and make it useful for them to change assets, dedicate resources to it. You have to move the needle economically. The other conversations follow. Even clean labeling, right? Which is some of the MAHA stuff. Like, if you change their economics at their bowl when they're making bread, you win. And then you get to tell every other story of the purity of your supply chain, the healthfulness of your food, those type of things. We really need to focus on the economics more than the stories.
Well, thank you for that. One of the things we did here today is I just jumped right into the sort of the hot takes, contrarian hot take. And you made mention of this earlier, that you grew up in and still are part of a farming family, a farming system. You all participate with let's call it the legacy of the existing supply chain. But maybe this would be a good time for you, Andrew, to give us a brief background on yourself and your path, and then talk about Farm Strategy, which of course is the company that you have started and are leading. And it's really a vehicle to advocate for some of these ideas that you have talked about here today.
Yeah, thanks. And it's fun. These are fun topics. So yeah, I currently live outside of Wichita, Kansas, about 20 miles north, a town called Newton, what we call our hometown. I grew up in a tiny town, Bushton, Kansas, little 1A 8-man football school. Farm kid, family farm is still running outside of Bushton there. Great little operation. Went to K-State and did ag econ with farm management with a minor in agronomy. And then I went back to the family farm. I was there for about 10 years, about 5 years into it. I had these ideas that we've discussed a little bit here, but essentially this idea that the information collapse. So I think the players that are in the market today need to be in the market, but information sharing between them, and thus the ability to hide value, share value, that type of stuff. I thought that information was going to become easier to access. And I also thought it was going to collapse some of the margin structure that each of those businesses had. And so I just went out and interviewed a bunch of millers and bakers. And the farm is less wheat today than it was when we started, but wheat is a food crop as compared to a feed crop. And so it gives us margin in that. But yeah, so I did interviews with millers and bakers and found out that the flour specs that they were selling to people had dynamically different structures to them than the grain contracts they were buying. And that was an information structure to start figuring out, okay, what's that actually worth? And that led us to where we're at. Started the company in 2017, brought in partners to help grow it, execute it, all of those. I mean, currently we have Central Valley Ag, Agmark, Comark Equity. These would be some of the co-op structures. Winfield United is a part of the company. And then brought in some of the Coke Ag guys to help me. I was a farm kid. And so they came in and really helped me to understand this and stand it up and formulate the thoughts better.
Poorly executed mergers and acquisitions destroy more value than they create. They can set your company back years. To defend your firm's position in the marketplace, you need access to the leading practices that unlock the greater potential of your people, processes, and systems. If you are undertaking a company transformation or pursuing an acquisition as a vehicle to grow, set up a call with Joe by visiting www.moshercg.com.
And so in many ways, I mean, the business, if we think about what the business does on a day-to-day basis, you are helping to enable and amplify the information sharing between that ultimate, either that miller or that food manufacturer, all the way back to the farm gate to see how do we solve for some of these manufacturing problems or milling problems with different, better segregated production at the farm. Are you working through Farm Strategy to ensure that your own farm is providing these certain value chains?
No, this is broad scale. Technically, this year, our family farm didn't actually grow any of the work that I'm doing. I will every once in a while convince my dad to take a flyer with me on something just because he's kind and he's good. But what we're doing is broad scale agriculture. I mean, export market interactions and sales, domestic interactions, domestic sales. It is focused on production scale, value propositions to bring. And so, we're working with farmers to grow grain that goes into a commercial grain system that has commercial level executions, milling functions, export markets, all of that functionality, dealing with export barriers, those type of things, figuring out how to overcome them so that production ag has a pathway to be an ingredient supplier. And then genetics is the big piece. Or one of our highly defensible positions, I should say. So also working with genetic suppliers to work on what is a step change value difference that allows us to shift out of a bulk commodity, right? So you're not selling to the farmer to make your margin per acre. You're actually receiving royalties based off of the ability to change ingredients or change into ingredients, you might say. And so working with genetics groups to advance those type of ideas too.
I think it's always an interesting exercise to kind of steel man the opposition. Of course, the opposition here is what we've always done. But I guess a question that I would have, to the extent that you're willing to respond, where do you get the most fervent opposition to this idea in the existing supply chain? And what is the argument against it? What is the argument against revisiting a supply chain such that we can solve problems with production ag, not science, and we can accrue more value to the producer? Because at a headline level, it's very attractive. It's something we can all get excited about. But I'm guessing that you don't have everyone necessarily just immediately jumping in the pool and having a good time.
No, I will say the most fervent opposition comes from the people, as with anything, right? Anything. The people that you're trying to get them to change their spending habits are the most fervent ones against you, as compared to the people that you're willing to give them marginally more money to do a little bit of work, right? So if I go to a farmer and I say, hey, I'm going to pay you a premium to grow this bushel and it's yield competitive, the farmer goes, oh, sounds fantastic, right? I can pay him to do the work, right? But you have to start your process where the business gets the most pushback is where you have to get somebody to change and spend $1 with you rather than spending $1 in their traditional market, right? And that's for us, it's all the downstream people. And so whether it be, millers, bakers, the international market has been actually very interesting in terms of its ability to adopt technology and see opportunity. But they have a product that they're selling that has a pre-printed label, that has already been through an approval, all that type of stuff. And so when you're trying to get them to switch over to getting their ingredients from production agriculture as compared to somebody more consistent, we can be consistent, but somebody that you can just call and they can deliver, right? Think of the supply chain ag has to build. Right now, we're working on seed plans for our wheat through the 2028 and 2029 crop year. There's going to be a lot of variability between here and there. Whereas if I can develop some formula for an additive, I can produce that formula again and again and again and again because it's a controlled process. It's not agriculture. And so being able to go to them and say, the product's going to perform. This is what you can expect of it. You can change your label. You can change your production system. We're going to be able to consistently provide for you. We're going to do this year in, year out, overcome the variability of agriculture. That's the hurdle that is the hardest to overcome, right? And you have to make money. They have to make money in doing that, right? You have to save them money today.
Yeah.
And then prove it long term.
You said earlier in the conversation that the idea that production ag can provide food solutions, that only wins if it makes economic sense, right? You made that point very clearly. And so in this case, the idea is not going to win on its merits. It has to win on its economics, as you said, and the point
Absolutely.
where someone is cutting checks.
Yeah.
They've gotten comfortable cutting checks, and maybe in the aggregate, the check that they cut is no different. It's just who is it going to, and what uncertainty does that introduce into a system that they become comfortable with? As you said, we produce a specific type of baked product. We need it to function in these particular ways, both when it's being made as well as when it's being shipped, as well as being stored when it's being consumed. We have a chain of supply chain partners and additive manufacturers and chemists that provide us a solution that ensures that happens every single time.
Mm-hmm.
And yes, we would love for more of our money to be flowing to the farm gate. But
Sure.
there's a lot of uncertainty in making that change and a lot of risk, both for the business, but also for people's individual, careers and their own sort of stability.
Yeah. And that's as it should be, right? Like, if you're production ag, you wouldn't want to walk in and see go to your local grocer and you see a bunch of bread, and we have this idea in our head of what a loaf of bread looks like, right? Call it 5.5 inches, nice rounded on top, a nice golden color, right? And you have that bread concept, and then you see this produced directly from the farm bread underneath of it. And this is at the large grocer. And it's got variable height, and some of it's a little bit caved in on the top. Like, people are going to look at that and go, that's interesting. It doesn't have the eye appeal, right? So like in these large games that we play. Now, I don't think that's the case at the mom and pop baker. There's some amount of joy in seeing the variability at the mom and pop baker, because you know that they touched it. You know that, oh, look at that little error. I mean, grandma's bread went Thanksgiving caved in half the time, right? And you loved it because it was hers. Well, that's not the case with the way that food is consumed by most people in the United States. I mean, a case in point, there at one point made it out on Twitter that some construction guy pulled out his tape measure and measured a foot-long sub, and it wasn't a foot long. And it became a really big deal, right? Like, that's the perception we have to deal with. And so if we want to say production ag has to go do food solutions, we have to understand what a solution is. We can't sit here and say, you should pay us more. You should look at us as a food provider for you. Like, are you actually solving their problems? Like, that's the question we have to go and get to. And before you can get that, you have to get into a relationship with them, which per our conversation we've had, sometimes there are 3 business units abstracted from this system. And so, a significant amount of education, that type of stuff.
Well, we can even go back, even penning back beyond relationships, and how do you build relationships? It's built on trust. Right? And so if supply chains writ large are built on trust, that's where this gets really interesting. I asked that question about where's the opposition and what's the nature of it. Much like what we've seen in the ag tech sort of environment, where things have moved from let's disintermediate the supply chain. Let's remove the middlemen. Let's solve real world problems. Problems of atoms, let's solve it with bits, and we'll have a digital solution that'll virtual elevator. And a lot of that has not panned out. Much of it's not worked out. But the industry has shifted to saying, perhaps we need to enhance the supply chain with technology and digital solutions that will amplify the value creation, efficiency, et cetera. And so what you're doing here is rebuilding the way that we look at the supply chain, though perhaps not rebuilding it entirely. What really shifts is, not who's involved, but maybe the role they play and how they participate in both value creation and value capture. And so again, all of that has to come down to trust. What has been your experience, I guess, Andrew, in trying to establish that underlying trust that will then enable the relationship, which will then enable people to get comfortable putting some risk on the table and trying this out for a portion of their, meeting their demand?
Number one, you got to have a product that works, right? You got to have a product that delivers, that shows economic advantage, that's there. I think the second thing is, because of the siloed nature and the abstract nature of each business unit that's next to each other, you have a set of people who have functioned with a kind of a trade mentality before. So I want to be in a relationship with you, but I want to withhold information from you as well. So if I'm the commercial elevator and I had a vomitoxin issue or something like that, I'm not going to let necessarily my downstream partner know I completely have that vomitoxin issue. I'm going to try to make sure and blend it off. And so I'm going to withhold the information that's necessary, but still be in a transactional relationship with you. And if I'm buying that grain, I'm going to not give them my total value proposition and exactly what I'm going to use their grain for. I'm going to actually give them what's necessary for us to do the transaction, right? And so one of the keys for farm strategy is like, we're not trying to displace anybody in the market. Like, we desperately need them. The farmer in central Kansas, take my dad, okay? He is not going to solve a baking problem in Japan by himself. He's not going to solve a baking problem on the East Coast by himself. It's just impossible. Even some of these really, really large farmers, you have to understand, you're not going to be able to do it alone. And so that's one of the areas that farm strategy has kind of said, like, look, our goal is to be a guide to the market, not actually be the market. And so, yeah, we want to understand your business practices. We understand what's there, and we want to incentivize you to do it. And so we're not trying to displace you. We're not trying to take your spot. We're sitting here and saying, hey, here's a value proposition I'd like to bring to you, right? So if you have the product that can deliver, right? And then you have to be able to show people this is your value in where we're going within the system. And you have to share that value with them. Like you honestly have to understand what it takes to move the needle, and you have to pay them. I mean, there's no high level thought, like people do what they're incentivized to do. And yeah, you got to bring it full circle for that.
Well, so one of the, not necessarily being skeptical here, but sort of maybe being realistic with the scale of the challenges, the grain handling industry, which is a significant portion of our listenership and our audience. That the grain handler, the grain originator, that has always been a game of bridging times and places and sometimes forms of surplus with times, places, and forms of deficit, right? Trading the spreads, taking basis risk, not taking price risk. You get futures markets, so you can be hedged. And so there's a lot of mechanisms around how that works. And there's a certain mindset that's required to identify the opportunities, to participate in your local trade area, to provide market access for your producers, but also, having your taste in the process. And you made an interesting comment that, we want to be in a relationship with you, but we want to keep information from you, right? And that's part of it as well. Maybe with the producer to some degree, certainly with the commercial that you're trading with, sometimes even intercompany. There's certain rivalries where P&Ls are not shared, and so maybe we're going to choose to sweep bin bottoms earlier than we might otherwise because this is going to put us in a position to capture marginal benefit. But let's look at that and say, okay, that's such a core part of, you couple that with, this is how merchandising and trading in grain works. And you couple that with, back to the very beginning of this conversation, leadership ranks that have also been focused on efficiency and moving volume, high volume of grain. When you get that trading mentality, that merchandising behavior, coupled with leadership expectations to move volume, for me, it almost feels like it's going to be hard it'd be hard to stop playing that commodity game.
Absolutely.
And I guess I'm curious what you guys are experiencing, or how does this transition happen that it creates the opportunity for the ideas of farm strategy to actually get some traction and participate in that?
Let's be clear from farm strategy. We don't ever want the commodity game to go away. That's the other piece, right? Because what we know is that at some point, there has to be an ability to liquidate stuff, right? Like, think of the cattle industry, okay? Late 80s, early 90s, we started to have this movement of U.S. premium beef marketing groups selling on a grid, right? Today, that's normal. Today, it's standard. It's like everywhere. But back then, it was really, really interesting. It was kind of cutting edge. It challenged the market. It's actually fun for us to go back and read those quotes from those guys, right? You used to buy a cattle not knowing what was underneath the hide, but hoping for it. And you kind of got what you got. And it's like, it's kind of where we're at, right? What happens in a market, and what farm strategy is here for, is not to sit here and not say, this is incredibly hard and this is difficult. We're here to actually sit here and say, is this something that you're willing to start to work with and start to entertain because we think it comes in the future, right? So we don't exactly know what it looks like 20 years from now, but we do know that if we start to move this way, the only way we're going to purify that model, The only way that we're going to figure out which grain facility should take IP grain and which facility should not take IP grain, or which part of the supply chain does this genetic fit in and which part of the supply chain does a different genetic fit in. Okay. We're not going to know that until we start to actually function in the market. Right. So like within our company, we're sitting here and saying there are major hurdles to do this. There are issues that are going to cause hardship and where we might have to say it's not going to work. Like, we're sorry, but it's just not going to work. However, we can't figure that out until we do it. Mm-hmm. And so you want to work with people that are, it's that whole like, don't go off of their competency, like go off of their character. Do they fit your culture? And then do they have competency? Like some of our best relationships are people that we've had very hard conversations with, but they're bought into the idea that in the future, I want to participate in a different market than just bulk handling, scratching margins where I can from a commercial elevator side. They want to participate. They want to be a food supplier, and they're willing to partner and take risk and challenge themselves to go there. And it's not without risk and it's not without failure, but you can sit on the sideline or you can actually go, get your hands dirty and see if you can help us build something. So we just got to be honest.
That's a great mindset. And, one of the things I failed to mention in my comment there a few minutes ago is I wonder aloud here, if in a new world, a world that does not exist, nor do I think it will exist, if in a new world, the food grains and the feed grains were decoupled from origination and trading perspective, how different might the opportunity or the bridge to a different cost stack, value stack be? Because, you think about the local elevator, the folks that are trading the corn and beans position may also be looking at wheat production in the area and those supply chains. And so it can get that food grain can get commingled with the mindset, the trading mindset and the imperatives of what the feed grain market provides. And so again, I don't think we're anywhere near what we would segregate out and people would be either food grain or feed grain trading houses. No. But that's going to be a drag, right? And a headwind that this kind of idea will have to confront and work through because that exists at the elevator.
Definitively. I think, opportunities that are out there, there's a lot of dynamics, but as the farmer has become more mobile with his grain out of the field, i.e. semi-trucks, right? As the farmer has become more mobile, there has been significantly more grain able to make it directly to terminal or directly to advantage storage space. Okay. And so in that moment, what we've done is we haven't necessarily rationalized what we would call the underutilized assets. So and this is from commercial grain, but as ag tips more towards larger farmers, truck fleets attached to these farmers, right? Like that becomes a logistical piece of harvest. It used to be getting fuel to the combine. Now the logistical piece is actually, do you have the trucks ready to move the grain away from the combine? Mm-hmm. And in that moment, can you rationalize other assets because the farmer's already rationalized them for you? He's willing to move that grain 15 miles for those 10-cent basis push, which gives you an advantage storage position. I'm not a commercial grain guy, but that is an opportunity that's there. And then in terms of like, how does this trade or what does the long term of it look? The honest answer is like, we don't know. But if you're sitting here and saying, you have to tell me exactly what it looks like, now we have to define our transactions. We have to define our relationship. We have to define what our communication looks like. But like Farm Strategy is not a crystal ball company. And I'll give you an example. Like we're advancing winter durum in Western Kansas. Okay. So this is a durum that is used to make pasta. It's never been grown. It now has the ability to vernalize. It's in Western Kansas. Okay. With that durum out there, durum isn't traded on the futures. It's a cash market trade, right? Mm-hmm. Is that a trade desk that does winter durum? Is that contracted acres that does winter durum? Is that some sort of aligned market signal? Is it basis HRW? To be honest with you, we don't completely know as a company. What we know is we have an end user right now that is backing us to develop this market. We can bring a value proposition to the grower. we can begin to interact with grain handlers to store, segregate, ship, build the transactions, and be coached consistently as we begin to scale up. This is how this market needs solved. This is how this market needs built. But if we were to just sit here and put it on a piece of paper, we wouldn't have designed this 3 years ago when we started the process. You have to be in it to get the lessons necessary to build it. And so, yeah, we expect headwinds. And there's a very, very, very efficient model out there that we're really excited exists, and we want it to exist. And you have to incentivize change. You have to find those aligned people who are willing to take a little risk, but are willing to be incentivized to change.
Well, as I've said multiple times in this program, and Andrew, building a business is a process of discovery, not design, right? And so what you learn along the way is really important, and what the ultimate outcome is you can't possibly predict. And I think so a couple of the closing messages, and this is a great place for us to close it today. Conviction in an opportunity and comfort with the uncertainty of the outcome. That's kind of entrepreneurship 101. And frankly, that's what ag is built upon, right? We're all convinced that this is necessary because the calories are, and whatever form they might take. How it goes year to year, how it goes over the course of a 5-year stretch, how it goes over the course of a career or a lifetime is very uncertain. Yet we all get up every day and we go about doing it. And so I'm really excited about this. We will make sure that we've got links to farm strategy and to yourself in the show notes for folks that want to get in touch and follow to learn more. But I wanted to just close today, Andrew, by saying thank you so much for taking the time, for sharing the ideas and walking through them, and for being part of the Pacesetter Pod.
Same to you. I've enjoyed this conversation and all the other ones that built up to it. It's really fun to discuss and dream. So thanks for a lot more time than just this 45 minutes together.
Yeah, no, this is great. And to our listeners, thank you as always for tuning in to today's episode. I hope and I trust that you found something not just of interest, but of actionable value to your operation and business in our conversation today. And assuming you did, please consider sharing this episode with someone else that you think would find similar benefit. It's the very best way you can support this show, the very best way you can help us get these ideas out there, which ultimately are about elevating thinking around strategy execution all across the ag supply chain. Thanks again for joining, and I look forward to having you right here next time on the Pacesetter Pod.
This is the podcastfactory.com.